Excellencies, ambassadors, dear colleagues, students, members of our institute's community, and of course, Excellency Minister. Welcome to the Institute of International Relations and Political Science of Vilnius University. We will have, as you know, today a lecture by Minister Lidington on a topic of European integration, more precisely EU and Eastern neighbourhood policy issues, British perspective of course, as well as European perspective. And just as a brief introduction, I would like to say that Minister is quite experienced member of the British Parliament, and I was a bit surprised to see that some of the newspapers, British journalists, are still referring to you as a young politician, despite the fact that you have been a member of the Parliament since '92, if I'm correct. Which is more or less total period of our independent recent history, and I am not sure that we have any members of Parliament who served since '92 at all. So to us, maybe Mr. Jurčėnas. Now I would like to pass the floor to the moderator of this discussion, Dr. Mindaugas Jurkynas, who will chair this event. So, Mindaugas, the floor is yours.
Just to say it very briefly, Minister holds doctorate for research on Elizabethan history, is that right?
Yes.
And also he had his previous positions as Shadow Junior Foreign Office Minister, and also Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, and also he's been involved in former activities as a consultant, parliamentary advisor, worked for RTS British Petroleum, and has been a special advisor for Douglas Hurd MP. His responsibilities cover European Union, Europe, including Balkans, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. NATO and the European security issues are also under his guidance, right? And the minister has got nearly 400 friends on Facebook. I did manage to pin him down on Twitter, but maybe my efforts were not successful. And he will deliver a speech on European Union and Eastern neighbourhood. And bearing in mind the fact that Lithuania doesn't have many interests, you can pin them down a triangle between, among actually energy security, transatlantic agenda, and neighbourhood. So I guess that, Minister, your presentation very neatly taps into our interest. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I would say, Director Ramunas, that you want to hang on to the description of a young politician as long as you possibly can. And actually, it doesn't matter how young or how junior you are. If you are elected as a member of Parliament, as soon as the press think you are wanting to make trouble for your party or government leadership, they start calling you a senior member of your party or of Parliament, because they know that that will make the better story. And I would say, Mindaugas, I think you're out of date. I think we're up to over 800 Facebook friends now. So you know, we're making progress. Although my sons tease me about my use of it incessantly. I wanted to talk today about the relationship between the European Union and its eastern neighbours. It's 20 years ago that Lithuania's elected representatives made their historic declaration of restored sovereignty, which set the country on its path to full independence once again, to international recognition and to membership today of both the European Union and of NATO. I worked in the Foreign Office, as Mindaugas said, at that time. I was not a member of Parliament. I was the political advisor to our then British Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd. But I remember watching the television news bulletins, and I remember the telegrams coming in, before email, the telegrams coming in from British ambassadors, reporting the first-hand accounts of those changes sweeping across Eastern and Central Europe. I remember being moved and impressed by the courage of the Lithuanian people and of their elected leaders at that time. I remember the siege of the television tower, the protests at the Parliament building, this sort of unlikely figure, a professor of music, emerging as a national leader who gave voice to his people at that moment. And I also had a real sense of the whole continent of Europe coming together again after the great fracture in European history and culture that happened in 1914 and was made still worse by the events of the Second World War and then of the Cold War afterwards. And for people here in Lithuania, of course, the impressions and the emotions were far, far more vivid as your struggle for freedom reached its climax. Patriotic people died in the cause. And at that time, the artificial political barriers between East and West in Europe were swept away because that is what the people demanded. The peoples of East Germany, of Poland, of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Baltic states and of others shared the values and the aspirations of their Western neighbours, and they demanded the same democratic and political freedoms. It was the solidarity and the ardent patriotism of the Lithuanian people that won them their freedom. But when I compare the history of Eastern and Central Europe since 1989 with that of the continent in the 1920s and 1930s, what is so striking is that this time around, freedom, democracy and the rule of law have been sustained and strengthened. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge that the European Union has many faults, but against that, in the balance, we should set its historic achievement in establishing a model in Europe for a community of nations governing relations among themselves according to the rule of law. That is a model of political development which has enabled the EU, through its policy of enlargement, to entrench democracy and human rights in parts of our continent where those traditions were crushed for most of the 20th century. Could we have predicted, back in 1989, that just 15 years later, within a single generation, those countries of Central and Eastern Europe would have been transformed into full, equal members of the European Union? I suspect not. The differences seemed too great. The speed of change required seemed impossible to achieve, and yet, here we are. Today, the European Union has different countries on its eastern border. Countries which were either not able or not ready to change as quickly as Lithuania did. The British government believes that European Union membership should be open to all European countries that want to join and can meet the necessary criteria. We believe that the EU should renew its commitment to keeping open the door to possible enlargement. No one has the right to deny that opportunity, that choice, to a country which wishes to apply. And we've seen the positive impact of a clear perspective for EU membership in the Western Balkans. As I saw myself just a few weeks ago in both Macedonia and Kosovo, the prospect of EU and indeed of NATO membership are the key drivers of the reforms that are needed to bring stability and prosperity to that entire region. Now, what I don't want to do is to put an arbitrary timescale on future enlargement of the EU to the east. But I am convinced it will happen, and the British government rejects the idea that there should be some sort of pause after the admission of Croatia. Lithuania too has consistently held to this vision of bringing our partners into the same European family. It is an inspiring vision which recalls the optimism of that first wave of enlargement to the east, and I believe we should work together to keep that spirit alive. Why? Because what happens in neighbouring countries has a direct impact on the EU itself. It is in all our interests to have secure, prosperous, politically stable neighbours. We want to help build strong democracies, the rule of law, and vibrant market economies in these countries. And success in that task will serve to strengthen the EU itself. Now, it's a difficult process. It's one that will demand a combination of real political leadership in the partner countries, plus support, encouragement and technical expertise from the European Union. And our neighbourhood policy and the Eastern Partnership are the structures that we use to develop this. In 2004, the EU launched its neighbourhood policy to foster political and economic cooperation and to ensure that enlargement did not create new divisions. Trade with the Eastern neighbourhood has subsequently increased at double-digit rates, aided by steady progress in reducing barriers and by the adoption of common rules and practices. Political engagement has increased both in profile and in intensity. Then, in 2009, the EU launched an Eastern Partnership to mark a step increase in the EU's commitment to closer economic integration and political cooperation. That partnership is a commitment by the European Union to 6 countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine, to help them to move closer to EU standards and values. It builds stronger trading links through deep and comprehensive free trade agreements that include the substantial adoption of common standards and steps towards the creation of a single economic space. We have launched negotiations on association agreements with 5 of the partner countries. These agreements are based on shared values. They cover a huge range of areas, from justice, democracy and security, to domestic reforms which are needed to create real economic opportunities. In return, the EU looks to these countries to align themselves more closely with the standards, whether political, economic or social, that they will need to meet if they aspire to join the EU as full members. The European Union has clearly signalled its commitment to help some of these countries in resolving their protracted conflicts. The partnership provides an opportunity for enhanced regional cooperation and also for greater European Union effort to work with Georgia and Russia to resolve their conflict, with Armenia and Azerbaijan on Nagorno-Karabakh, and in the OSCE's 5+2 discussions on Transnistria. And of course, next year, when Lithuania takes over the chairmanship of the OSCE, Lithuania will have a very important leading role through that organisation in trying to tackle these 3 unresolved conflicts. Now, some in Russia have been concerned by our outreach to these 6 partners, but it's not a case of choosing between the West and Moscow. Stronger democracy and better economic management are good for the whole region, and that includes good for Russia.